Will be up in just a few minutes. As I was introduced, I didn't start off this journey being the pro-justice person that you see before you now. I grew up in the 40s and 50s when in our community, Israel was a land without people for a people without a land, and that was the story that I heard. That's a story that is a very strong story in the American Jewish community and probably in the Israeli Jewish community as well. And it wasn't until just a few years ago that I came to realize there was a second story. And until the second story is understood, then the first story at this point is the story that most of us know. This is an issue of what I saw in my trip to Israel. The first thing that a visitor typically sees when they go to Jerusalem is something called Yad Vashem, and Yad Vashem is the Holocaust Museum. There's a similar one in Washington, D.C. And part of the reason why I bring this up is because in order to understand why Israel's behaving the way it is, one has to understand the effect of the Holocaust on the Jewish people and the Jewish psyche. Israel right now is the fourth most powerful military nation in the world. And yet, if you ask a typical Israeli or you ask a typical American Jew, for us, the Holocaust is just a night away. I was explaining that, in my house, I probably have 30 books on the Holocaust. Most Jewish families do, and painful though it is to read, we're very familiar with that story. And that story is actually not even the correct story itself, but we'll leave that for another visit. So I started off, really my interest in Israel-Palestine began when my wife, who's a Unitarian Universalist, became upset because in all things, when it comes to politics, I am a liberal and a dove, but when it came to Israel, I sprouted hawk's wings. So she said, well, let's go there and let's see. Prior to that, I had read a wonderful book that I would recommend to you. It's called The Lemon Tree. Written by a woman named Dahlia Landau, who was a Holocaust survivor. And one day, knocking on the door of her house, a Palestinian gentleman comes to see if he can visit the house, and it's the house that he grew up in. And over the next 30 years, she and Bashir develop a relationship, and through that, the second story, the story of the Palestinians, unfolds. One of the most powerful slides that I'm going to kind of prepare you for is a slide that that kind of shows a little bit about the attempts of the Israeli government to wipe out any vestige of Palestinian villages or Palestinian culture in Israel and in Palestine. And I wanted to start off with this picture because if you can hold this picture in your mind, then the rest of the story will help you to make sense of it. Because if there are no olive trees, if there are no orchards, if there are no villages,
it's not showing here. You don't see.
Terrific.
Yes. Yes.
Good on here. You're good on this side.
Very good. Thank you. This is two photographs, one taken in the 30s. I can get this bigger for you, I think. One taken during the 30s and one taken 2 years ago. It's the same village. Except in the second village, the Jewish National Fund has planted a forest on top of the village. Today in the Jewish community, if you're going to celebrate some life cycle event, you buy trees in Israel. I didn't realize that the trees that you were buying in Israel were planted on top of villages as a way to eventually eliminate the memory of those villages. Surely we don't have to do this. We went with the Interfaith Peace Builders, which started in 1914, and this is the group that we went with. We spent 2 weeks in the West Bank and then another 2 weeks in Israel. There's lots of victimization to go on between the number of Israelis that have been killed, the number of Palestinians that can be killed. It's really not the issue at this point. The issue is how does one move forward? This is a picture of West Jerusalem, very verdant, very pretty. This is East Jerusalem. Quite a contrast between the two parts of the same city. One of the things that surprised me in being in the West Bank is I did not know that there were a number of peace groups. The number of peace groups, Arab peace groups, Arab-Israeli peace groups, and Israeli peace groups that exist and that are functioning right now. B'Tselem is one of them. B'Tselem in Hebrew means in God's image. They collect data. This is a picture of the 67 border, and we're going to come back to this picture from time to time because what you see around the West Bank is something called the Green Line. And later, when I talk about the separation barrier, you would think if the purpose of the separation barrier is security, you will find that the separation barrier goes way, way inside the Green Line on the Palestinian lands. And it is true that as part of the Torah, there's the notion that God gives this land to the Jewish people. However, there's a contract. The contract is, yes, you get this land, but in order to have this land, the first rule is you have to be neighbors and you can't oppress the strangers in this land. Otherwise, you don't deserve the land and you don't get the land. There's a family we stayed with in Beit Sachor. One of the issues that we found in the West Bank is, there are the Jews, there are the Zionists, and there's the Israelis. And those are three very different entities. But among the people living in the West Bank, it's all one entity. Whether it's the Jews or whether the Zionists or whether it's the Israelis, that's seen as one particular group. This is just a list of the number of illegal settlements that exist in the Palestinian territories. And by the way, my email is sbell@bury.edu. And if you want a copy of some of these slides, I'll be glad to send them to you. For the 30 minutes that I've got or so, I probably won't be able to handle questions so that everybody on the panel gets a chance to go. But you can certainly email me, and I'll be glad to respond to you individually. One of the things we have a computer scientist named Nadim who's I work with at Bury, and I asked him, what might I expect from the people that are here today? How much do they know about the Israel-Palestinian issue? And he said, well, probably as much as most Americans might know. And most Americans don't know anything. I hope you know more than most Americans. Most Israelis don't know anything. Now, it may be that they don't want to know anything. But if you look at this particular sign says, if you're an Israeli, you cannot go into the West Bank. It is illegal for Israelis to go into Bethlehem, into Nazareth, into Ramallah, at the Berzeit. So part of it is the inability to get information. Typically, if you ask